In today's episode of my podcast story, we have Scott Maderer, the host of the podcast Inspired Stewardship. Scott's show is dedicated to guiding Christians in mastering their time, talent, and treasures, empowering them to live out their true calling. With nearly 3 decades of experience in education and a passion for coaching, Scott, along with his wife Carrie, founded Inspired Stewardship to help individuals and couples align their lives with their values and purpose. As certified human behavior consultants and members of the John Maxwell team, they focus on fostering understanding and growth in their clients. Scott's journey is not just about coaching, it's about transforming lives and building a community that thrives on authenticity and service. He's here to share his inspiring journey on how he built his show from the ground up and the impact it's making in the world. Tell us your name and the name of your podcast and what your podcast is about.
Sure. So my name is Scott Maderer, and the name of the podcast is Inspired Stewardship. Basically, the worldview of that podcast is that by mastering your time, your talent, and your treasures, that you can learn to live out your calling. So we talk a lot about leadership and about communication, and then about time and about money, and kind of how all of those things fit together along with our faith.
How long have you been doing the podcast?
So I started it January 8th, 2018.
That's about 7 years now.
About 7 years now. Yep.
How time flies.
Well, I promised whenever I started it, I was going to try it for 6 months and I was going to see whether I liked it or not. And I still haven't figured out whether I like it or not. So I'm still doing it.
You sure? Yeah, wow, that's brilliant. Wow, 7 years.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to
7
wrap my head
years and
around it.
I've got over 1,600 episodes.
1,600. How often do you publish episodes?
Right now I'm publishing twice a week, but at one time I was publishing 6 times a week. So,
Ooh, okay. So that's how they stop
yeah, that's why it's so
the
many.
episodes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 1,500 by the main numbers, but I used to do one on Saturday that I called Saturday Night Specials that was numbered kind of its own, they were numbered differently. And so if you add, there was about 190 of those. So if you add those in, I'm actually over 1,600 episodes.
What was the inspiration that led to you starting the podcast? Where did the idea come from? Why did you even start the podcast in the first place?
So I had started a business. I'm a full-time coach. I work with people in those areas of stewardship, so time, talent, and money. And it was kind of a way of processing the way I thought about those topics. It was a way of interviewing other people and meeting other people that kind of spoke on those topics. So it was a way of learning and then of making connections and networking. And because I don't like to write, I didn't want to sit down and start a blog or start writing things. However, I love to talk. You stick a microphone in front of me and I'm just fine talking on it. So I said, okay, I'm going to start a podcast. And that's where it started from. So it's a topic I've been studying for over 30 years. And it was kind of like, okay, let me start talking through this and putting it together myself. Let me start sharing it, using it for marketing. Let me start making connections with it, all of those things together. And then eventually it's also content that I turned into a book. So I jokingly tell people I didn't write a book, I spoke a book because the book came out of the podcast, not out of sitting down and writing a book.
Yeah. You've been doing the podcast for 7 years now. How's the podcast impacted you personally? Before we talk about, the impact to the audience and all that.
I think a lot of it is it gives me more confidence. It gives me more comfort with talking about things. It's helped me as a coach in terms of learning things, processing things, and then hearing how other people think about and learn and do, because I'll have other experts on that work in the same areas that I do. And, they may approach it a different way or use different language. So it's increased my learning. And then from a, just kind of personal time standpoint, I think it's also taught me a lot of skills in terms of managing my schedule, managing my time, being able to arrange things. Again, at one time I was podcasting 6 days a week while working full time, while having a family and a kid and church and this and that. It's basically taught me a lot about how to organize, to think. And then the other thing that I think is an unspoken thing that I think really helps, or it's taught me to do, is I look at the world differently in terms of, I'm always looking at the world from the point of view of, is this something that is relevant? I tell people it's kind of like having a content filter. I hear something on the radio and I immediately start thinking about, oh, that could be, I could approach that this way, or I could talk about that like this, or I could, so it just kind of, everything enters my consciousness from the point of view of, how does this fit into what I want to talk about, or what I want to think about, or what I can use with my podcast or my clients or my things, the content, but not kind of in a, how do I turn this into content, but more of a, how does this fit into the structure that I already have?
Yeah. Well, Um, Currently, I love for you to walk us through how you make your podcast from idea to booking guests and all that down to publishing.
Sure. So for booking guests, I actually use Podmatch. That's actually where we connected. I
Yeah.
used to book guests by actually writing them down, the old fashioned way with just hearing somebody on another podcast, or I've made friends with a lot of people that are in the publishing industry. And so, I've taught them what my podcast is about. And so they'll send me authors and people that, have a message and things. And that I still get guests from there and continue to do that today. And then I've made friends with a lot of other people, and my current guests sometimes will introduce me to a future guest. So you've got all of those sorts of methods. But I think Podmatch for me has really made it a lot easier to filter and find good quality guests that actually are relevant a lot quicker and easier just because they're all kind of right there.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So you get guests on Podmatch, and
And
then
then from production, I use Calendar Link, set up a pre-interview. I always do a pre-interview with my guest. I'll talk about a solo episode in a second, but for guest episodes, I do a pre-interview, usually about, 20 minutes. The idea I've discovered over the years that getting on for 15 or 20 minutes before I actually have my main interview, the guest gets a little more comfortable. I get more comfortable. They kind of know what to expect. And then, it makes the interview run easier. I always pre-write my questions and send them to the guest about 48 hours in advance. I'll tell you the same thing I tell my guests. I don't do that so you can obsess over the questions, but I do that so that they have a chance to look at them, because occasionally somebody will say, "Hey, if you'll tweak this question, you're going to get a better story, or that's going to connect better to what I want to, the message that I'm sharing." And I always want to be able to do that for the guest and present them in the best possible light. So 99% of the time, my questions go just as they are, and about 1% there's something to tweak. And then we jump on a Zoom, and I actually record via Zoom. I know there's other technology out there, but that's kind of how I've built up my systems to do it. And then once I've recorded, I download that. I load that into some Audacity software, add in the intros and the outros and all of that, do a light edit. And then I usually use Descript to produce a transcript and do a little bit more editing. And then from there, I level it out, schedule it, produce a show notes, and get everything ready to go. And I'm usually like right now, I think the podcast I just uploaded a couple of, like, this weekend doesn't go live until sometime in June, so I'm usually a month or two ahead. I work pretty far ahead.
you're the one doing handling everything from recording,
I do everything.
production, and everything.
Yeah.
Wow.
I currently don't outsource any of it, and I never have, not because I can't, but just I've kind of turned it into a batch and a system and kind of produce everything myself. And really doesn't take me that long, from finding a guest to writing questions to actually doing the interview, all of the editing, scheduling, uploading and scheduling for a 1 hour interview or a 40-minute interview. It probably takes me about 3.5 to 4 hours of work on average. And so I can usually, and again, I work ahead and I just kind of batch things out and do them ahead of time. For a solo episode, I've got a database. I've got a Excel spreadsheet that I keep, that I just capture ideas as they come to me. I've probably got over 1,000 ideas on there. And so a lot of, it's really just a matter of pulling a topic from there. More or less, I just kind of pick one that picks my interest today. I used to script everything out and do it in detail. Now I just kind of make myself 4 or 5 bullets. This is the topic. This is kind of the bullets I want to hit, record straight into the software, do a light edit and upload it. Those really now only take me about an hour to produce one from beginning to end. And then I also do, and this is currently what I'm doing, as an interview. And then this type, one of the solo episodes I do is what I call a spiritual foundation episode. So I actually take a piece of scripture and just kind of talk about that. So in that case, I've already got the topics, because I literally just use the lectionary and just kind of go straight through the scripture that they'd be covering that Sunday at the church I go to, kind of thing. So and again, I'm working ahead, but I basically do that because I do a lot of work with churches, and I even go in and preach and do workshops and that kind of thing in church environments. So it kind of keeps me fresh and in touch with the scripture. So there's kind of 3 different kinds of episodes, and I mix and match them over the years.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for walking us through the workflow and the operation of the podcast and how it gets made. Off the top of your head, how much would you say it costs you to, like, spend on the software, the apps for running the podcast in
I
a
spend
month?
about $60 a month on the host and then software tools and things. I spend about $60 to $100 a month, so about $1,200 a year. Maybe a few odds and ends here and there, so maybe $1,000 to $1,500 a year.
Okay, okay, okay. Now that you've been doing the podcast for 7 years, I want to you had an inspiration to start a podcast to help people manage their time, talent, and is it treasure you said?
Treasures money.
Yeah, okay,
Mhm.
yeah, that's money. Yeah, I was like, I don't think it was tea. I was something else. Yeah. Now that you've been in for 7 years, right? And with that original purpose and intention, how is the podcast doing now?
I actually think it does pretty well. I get on average somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 downloads on an episode, which is considered very good for a
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah.
That's not Joe Rogan numbers, but it's not bad.
Yeah, I mean,
you
it's the
know,
top 1% or so.
yeah, that's in the top 1 to 2%. And then I basically, I've gotten clients from it. I've gotten folks that have reached out to me and hired me because of it. It also has, sold books for me and all of those things. So there's definitely some monetary impact. And then it's also, just being able to look down and see that I've got folks listening in, 180 countries or, all of that sort of thing is really a lot of fun. One of the weird things about my podcast is, most English speaking podcasts, the number one downloads are in the United States. So that's true for me. But what I've heard from most podcasters is their number two and number three is kind of Canada and the United Kingdom. And for me, my number two place that I get the most downloads from is actually India. And I don't know why. India is usually in the top 5 for people, but I'm the only person I've ever met yet that has it as number 2. And I have no idea why, but very early on, like probably in the first year I was podcasting, all of a sudden my numbers in India jumped up. For a while, they were actually even above the United States numbers. So the only thing I can figure is somebody somewhere in India found my podcast, really liked it, and they must have had some sort of influence and they shared it and it got popular. And it's kind of remained popular ever since in India. The United States now downloads more, but India is still my number 2. So, that's fun. Just realizing that you're reaching people all over the world, that there's somebody out there listening to it and, presumably getting some benefit because they continue to listen to it. So you also hear back occasionally, I get reviews or I'll get an email from somebody talking about how they liked it or how this particular episode got value and, how it impacted them in some way. Don't get nearly as many of those as I wish I did because you get one and you're
Can
like, this is awesome, but
I don't know how easy it is. I'd love to, like, I don't know if it would be possible for us to, like, can you remember some of the words or maybe read a couple of maybe your favorite for us if it's
yeah,
possible. But if not, you can just paraphrase the message
I'll
and tell
probably
us.
be paraphrasing because I don't have them handy where I could pull it up
Okay.
real time. Um, a lot of them, it's funny because I get comments from folks that start out like when I first started listening to this, I kind of got mad. And it's like, that great. I made you mad. That's not what I was going for. And then they come back and they're
Yeah.
like, but the more I listened to it, the more it started to make sense. And, I started trying to do some of the stuff that you talked about or that your guests talked about. And it helped me in some way. It changed the way I approached my money. It changed the way I approach communication. It changed the way I approach leadership. Yeah, I know people that have written in and said they decided to change jobs because we talk a lot about calling and purpose. And, they've changed something like that because of it. I've gotten a few from folks. It's interesting because I actually have a lot of female listeners, but a lot of my female listeners, when I've surveyed them, tell me that they're listening for their husband. And so I've asked, what do you mean by that? And they're like, well, my husband really has this thing that he really wants to do, but he feels like he can't do it because we don't have enough time. We don't have enough money. We don't have. So I've been listening to your podcast to kind of give myself the vocabulary so I can talk to him about doing the thing that I feel like he's really supposed to be doing, living out his calling. And that's always really impactful because that is kind of the underlying idea behind it is that
Yeah.
if we do these things, we can do what we're supposed to do and not feel trapped.
Oh, oh, that's yeah. But other than messages and I'm getting these emails and from this person, have you like had the opportunity to talk to these to talk to them one on one? just the way we're chatting?
I have met folks either through chat or through at like podcast convention or that kind of thing, podcast conferences where I'll run into somebody and they're like, "Oh yeah, I've listened to your show after," and we talk about it. So again, not as much as I wish. I haven't really done meetups or any of that sort of thing, but it is. I have run into folks or had folks reach out and message me on Messenger or Facebook or those sorts of things, and then gotten to have a conversation or jumped on a Zoom with them and had a conversation. So it's always, that's always the best because you get to see their face and kind of interact with them a little bit more.
Yeah. Wow. Now, I noticed earlier on when you were explaining your podcast, you mentioned that you do have a business, and the business you do is you coach people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing is you coach people on stewardship, which is how to
Mm-hmm.
manage their time, their treasure, and their talent.
Mm-hmm. That's
So
absolutely correct.
I'll be correct if I say that this is a business pod. Now, of course, not. It's meant
Mm-hmm.
to like help people, but it's a business podcast. I mean, isn't that what all business
Part of it is
does?
for marketing. Absolutely. Yeah. Part of it is to
Yeah.
tell people what I do as a coach. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So the reason I'm kind of paraphrasing and trying to like explain and make sure I get everything correct is because, hey, just a quick break. If you enjoying the insights so far and want even more behind the scenes ideas, inspiration and tools for growing your own podcast, join my email list at mypodcaststory.com/join. That is mypodcaststory.com/join. You get access to helpful resources, exclusive updates, and the kind of stuff I only share with my email subscribers. Whether you're starting out or already podcasting, there's something valuable waiting for you. Head over to mypodcaststory.com/join and subscribe. Now, back to the episode. Yes, I want to ask you, does the podcast make money?
So directly, no. Indirectly, yes. So here's what I mean by that. Directly in terms of, do I monetize the podcast? Do I have ads or sponsors or any of that sort of stuff? The answer is no. However, when I can get one client and that pays for the podcast for a year or more. And I've gotten that, I know for a fact, I've gotten guests, I've gotten clients from the podcast, at least 9 or 10. I say that I got as a fact. What I mean by that is people that have actually said, one of the reasons I reached out to you as a coach is because I've listened to your podcast. However, I've also had a lot of people that it's like, what I find out is, they've listened to the podcast and then they saw me on somebody else's podcast and then they, maybe they bought my book and then they read that and then they reach out to me. So even there you end up with, there's sources of monetary gain from it that are indirect. So I jokingly say, if you looked at it as on the books, the podcast costs me money, but I actually think it's made me money if you kind of include all of those incidentals. I've gotten speaking events because of it. The book that I've written, all of that content came out of it. I've gotten to invited to go to various events because of the podcast. So all of that stuff is indirect money, but it is still, I still give credit to the podcast for it.
Yeah. Can you walk us through how like your first speaking engagement you got directly from the podcast and maybe share the subsequent speaking engagements from the podcast too?
Sure. So the first one I ever got was, I had a guest that I'd invited on, and at the end of it, he said, "Hey, I've got a virtual summit coming up, and we've been engaging on this topic. I know you talk on this. Would you be willing to come talk?" That literally was that quick and easy of a conversation. I said, "Absolutely, tell me more." And then we kind of went from there, and I arranged it. And he was running a fatherhood kind of summit for fathers, and so I came in and talked on the idea of kind of finding your calling and being a dad and how that fit into you and your marriage and these sorts of things. It was great. I enjoyed doing it, and it was not paid at that time, but again, what ended up happening is I got some folks that ended up coming over and getting in my audience. And then I also had some folks that ended up hiring me as a coach. So I didn't get paid to speak, but I got paid to speak. My latest one, my most recent one, has actually come out of the podcast and the book kind of together, where I met with somebody and they want me to come and speak to their organization on kind of the book. But again, since the book and the podcast kind of overlap, they knew I did the podcast. They actually went and listened to the podcast before they reached out to me, because as they said, they knew the topic they wanted me to talk on was from the book, but they wanted to hear me speak first,
Yeah.
quick and easy listen to the podcast. They're like, okay, this guy's not a total idiot. He can put together an English sentence. Let's have a conversation now.
Yeah.
And I think that's something about the podcast. Part of the value of it is they do get to hear you speak, and they get to it. And there's also a certain amount of it, quite frankly, if you can podcast, especially for a long time, there's a certain amount of authority that comes with it. You're not going to freak out, being in front of a crowd of people or on a microphone and those sorts of things. You've got a certain amount of stability that shows that you could probably go do a speaking event and it wouldn't be the end of the world.
Can you still remember the first paid speaking gig you got from the podcast?
From the podcast? Yeah, it was actually speaking to a women's entrepreneurial group, and they paid me to come in and speak on communication and personality, which is kind of the talent thing. They were all business owners, they were all business leaders, and they kind of wanted a thing on DISC and how they could use that with their employees. That was probably the first one I got. And I think I was paid, I think it was $100. It might have been 75. And this was 2000 and it was before COVID. So 2019,
Okay,
so
so
it would have
that's
been
like 1 year into the
2019,
podcast,
about a year
and
and
you
a
started
half.
getting the
Yeah.
speaking gig. Yeah. Oh,
Year and a
that's
half.
pretty fast. That's pretty fast. Usually, some persons they have to wait 2-3 years, and then for anyone even notices them.
Yeah. And that was a local group, and it was somebody who knew me as well as listened to the podcast. And again, in this case, what she did is took the podcast to her leadership and said, hey, and took an episode where I talked on those topics and said, I want him to come present to our group, and this is what we want to do. So I think sometimes too, again, that's the other piece of it is I had made connections with people by inviting them on my show or by going on their show and those sorts of things. So a lot of times it's those networking opportunities that lead to the speaking events as well, just because people understand, oh, you're talking on this topic. You're able to be an expert on this topic. Let me bring you into my group.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned earlier on that you spoke the book into existence. I want to talk about that. What was the flow like? At what point did you decide to say, okay, I'm going to write a book? And then how did you? Can you like walk us through that?
So back, I've always wanted to write a book. That's kind of been one of my bucket list items. I've always wanted to do it. I worked with a coach. I worked with somebody who's a writing coach. And what we did is I went through and identified podcast episodes that kind of had the topics and the messages that I wanted to include in the book. And we put together an outline. And then I started kind of pulling transcripts together of those topics. I do transcripts on all my episodes, so I had transcripts already. And then it was a matter of finding the holes. Where have I not talked on a topic that I want to include in the book that I don't have anything on the outline? And I literally went and recorded a podcast episode on those topics, and then did a transcript and then said, okay, that fills in that hole. And basically we kind of put the outline together. And then I worked with an editing team to kind of go back through it and do some rewrites, and because there's a difference in how you speak and how things look on the written page. And so they would do that kind of cleanup where they would come in and take it out of just a straight transcript and turn it more into a written book. And then we produced some graphics and other things that needed to go with it. Obviously, those didn't exist in the podcast. I don't really reference an image when I'm doing an audio podcast. So we added some imagery and those sorts of things, and then worked with a publisher, and I was published by Morgan James. So they helped me with cover art and formatting and putting it all together, and so that's how Inspired Living came to an existence and got out into the world.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's
And
really,
a
really.
lot of the content was already there, so it was really just a matter of organizing it and then working with copy editors and editors to clean it up and put it together. And they translated it for me. So I probably never would have written a book if I actually had to sit down and type all of these words out. I don't think I don't think the book would exist.
Yeah, I think that's like the major problem with podcasters that are creating evergreen content is once they release the episode, that's the end of the episode. They don't go back to say, okay, how can I like change or translate the value from this episode into a different form, a different media,
Right.
so that people can still consume, can still listen, can still read, can still get the value from it. Because the stuff we're talking about is evergreen. I mean, talent, it's the same. Same message. Someone can listen 5 years from now and still say, yeah, awesome, powerful message. I love that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about podcasts that I think people forget is how long tail it is. Again, I've got 1,600 episodes. And so it's interesting because I'll get a new listener. And of course, on Apple, they can see about 300, they can see the last 300 episodes. But then I'll
Yeah.
find people that'll go back and they'll find the back catalog, and start downloading
Wow.
it, And so it's like, I do have some folks that have gone back and pulled, 800 or more episodes because they want to keep going with it. And my episodes are short on purpose. My interviews are about 30 to 40 minutes. My solo episodes are usually 15 to 30 minutes. So, most of my episodes are what I jokingly call them the commute episodes. They take you about the length of time you can commute,
Yeah.
on average. So it's kind of a chance for folks to just kind of listen, get their day started. I'm trying not to do, not that there's anything wrong with them, but for me, I just don't like doing the style of a 4.5 hour marathon episode. I'd rather do short and sweet and kind of get them moving and then move on.
I'm curious to know, you went from publishing 6 times a week and now you're doing twice a week.
hmm
Why the change?
A lot of it has been because of one, just slowing down a little bit on the time that I was spending. As I've gotten other components of my business have picked up, I'm doing more speaking, I'm doing more workshops, I'm doing other things. So it's really just a matter of balancing where my time is available and where I spend it on the podcast versus other parts of it. I continue to get value from a marketing perspective and all of those other things. So I don't feel like I've lost a lot by cutting down. But at the same time, I don't know, at a later point in my career, I may pick back up and go to 3 or 4 or 5 times a week. I don't know. But, so it's not really been any sort of, major plan other than just as the business has shifted and different components of the business have required more or less time, I've shifted around. I could continue to produce 6 and outsource some of the work, but I just chose to kind of slow down a little bit instead, and it's worked.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. As long as and that's the sweet thing about podcasts, you get to redesign and change everything
hmm
and say, okay, I want once a week, I want twice a week. Like anything you want to do, it's your show and you call the shots.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of import to being consistent for a period of time. In other words, I think it would frustrate people if like one week there's 3 episodes and the next week there's one, and then you go four
Yeah,
weeks and then that's not fun. But like when I decided to go from 5 to 6, I communicated that on the podcast as well. And then I kind of did it. And then I did that for over a year, and then I went back from 6 down to 2. Well, I communicated that. And then I've committed to doing that for a period of time. So I don't think you want to change willy nilly, but at the same time, like you said, I think if you've got reasons, you can have that. That's again, some people set them up by seasons. They come in and they release a block and then they take a break. All of those work. You
yeah,
kind of have to design, what do you want for the podcast? What do you want from the podcast? How much time and energy and money are you willing to put into it? And then you get to build it the way you want to kind of fit those criteria. I think a lot of folks fall into the trap of thinking, whatever podcasts they listen to, it's like, oh, I have to do it that way. It's like, why?
yeah,
I'll give you an example. The first interviews I was doing, I actually would interview the guest for 2 hours. However, I then took that 2 hour and because I covered different blocks of information. So I literally cut that interview up into 4 podcasts. So I had the first podcast would be on time and then talent and then treasures. I broke them up into 3 things like that. And then kind of like a more of a Q&A kind of portion, kind of talking about the guests themselves. So I literally
yeah,
had themed the episode, and I would take that 2 hour episode and I would cut it up into 4 episodes and release it on 4 sequential Mondays. So if you go back to my very first interviews, you'll see it's the same person for 4 weeks in a row. Well, mechanically, I interviewed them one time, but then on the back end, I put that into 4 sections and kind of introduced each of those sections. Worked fine. A lot of people were like, "Oh, you can't do an interview that way. That won't work." And I'm like, "Well, why not?" You know, I'm going to try it and see how it works. Turns out people liked it just fine. It didn't bother people a bit. So you don't have to be locked in just because a lot of people do it a certain way or the podcast you listen to do it a certain way. You don't have to be locked in and doing it that way. You can recreate and do something a little different. And I think in a lot of ways that actually can help you stand out.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, 7 years and you get to realize that I can adapt and change things to work for me, not against me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's where I always think of it like a Venn diagram, right? So, those are those diagrams with the overlooking circles where one diagram is kind of your audience, right? Who your listener, the person that you want to reach. What do they like? What do they not like? How are they listening? What's important to them? All of that. Then one circle is kind of you as the podcast host. What are you good at? What do you like to do? How do you want to interact? So now look for where those two circles overlap. And then the third circle is sort of what are your bigger goals for the podcast, or for that could be, I want this to be a marketing podcast like mine, where I'm using it to market my business, or am I using this to grow an audience, or am I using it, what am I trying to accomplish? Do I want to monetize the podcast? Is that my goal? Whatever it is. And when you find the spot where those three circles overlap, you know, that's when the podcast will work the best, because if you're doing something that you hate doing, you're not going to stick to it long enough to have success in the podcast anyway.
Yeah.
If you hate doing interviews, don't go start an interview podcast. That's stupid. But at the same time, don't just think, oh, I'm not good at interviewing, so I can't have an interview podcast. My
Yeah.
first interviews were bad. I got better at it.
Yeah.
But realistically, if I go back and listen to my first ones, I'm like, oh man,
Terrible.
geez, that was a stupid question. Why did I ask that question? You get better at it with practice. So it is that balance of stay within your strengths, but also realize that you can learn the skills kind of while you're doing it. Don't wait until you think you're going to be perfect at it before you get started.
Wow. Don't wait until you get perfect before you get started. The strange thing about podcasting is that we're doing it in public. And it's just like a book, unlike a book, you do the first, second, third draft in private, but
And
with a
nobody ever
podcast,
sees it. Yep.
everything is happening in public.
Yep. Yeah. But to that point, go ask any podcaster who's been out there for more than 2 years. Okay. So I'm not talking somebody that's released 7 episodes. I'm talking somebody that has been podcasting at least once a week for a couple of years, and go ask them, hey, I want to go listen to your first episode. And they're all going to go, oh, man, don't listen to the first one. It was so bad. They're all going to say that. That's their natural reflex. We all say it because, and honestly, think about it for a minute. If I said my first episode is every bit as good as my last episode, it's like, really? You've learned nothing after 2 years? You haven't gotten any better in 2 years? That's kind of sad.
Yeah.
So you should be getting better as you go. Now, does that mean I do perfect every single episode? Of course not.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Am I better today than I was when I started 7 years ago? I hope so.
Yeah. Earlier on, you said you jokingly said that you started the podcast and you said you were going to do it for 6 months, and then if it wasn't for you, you're going to stop doing it. Now, you didn't mention that you're not sure yet. You don't even know if the podcast is for you. And so I want to ask, was that a joke, or are you serious?
It's a joke, but it's also serious. Now, there is a part of it that's serious. I really did. When I started, I wrote down on paper, I'm going to do this for at least 6 months, and then I'll evaluate. But then I'll figure out whether I want to keep doing it or not. And after 6 months, it was like, I'm enjoying this. I feel like I'm getting better. I'm starting to get some traction. Not a ton, but, at that point, more than just my mom was downloading it. So that's a win, It's like, okay, so I can keep going. And so I said, okay, I'll do it another 6 months. And I really do. Every 6 months, I sit down and evaluate, hey, do I want to keep spending my time this way? Do I want to make any difference? Do I want to change anything? That's again, when I changed from 5 episodes to 6, and when I changed from 6 to 2, that was at one of those 6-month evaluation periods where I was like, yeah, I want to make a shift right now because of what's going on in my life. Yeah, at some of these 6-month periods, I probably will look up and go, I'm not getting enough bang for the buck anymore. This isn't really where I want to spend my time. I'm going to pivot and do something different. But as of yet, that hasn't happened.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess you've realized that this is the thing, but you just like say, okay, I could evolve and change in the future. But for now, it's what's me sticking around for 7 years and for the next couple of years.
Right. Yeah. I try not to ever lock myself in and think that this is the only thing I want to do. It will probably continue to evolve. I may start a different podcast and grandfather this one out. I may add in video and do, something. There's all sorts of things you can do to evolve it, but will I go start something where I have to write a blog every day instead of talking on a microphone? Definitely not. I'm going to continue to play to my strengths, and I'd rather talk at a microphone than sit and write. So I'm going to do that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
It's a good thing you mentioned um audio and speaking to the mic. Are you doing audio and video or just audio podcast?
Currently, my podcast has remained just audio. I've not added video at all. Again,
Are you
that's one of
active
those things
on
I
YouTube?
might evaluate later, but I haven't yet.
Are you active on YouTube?
I have the audio on YouTube, yes, but it's
Okay, so
just
you
as an
do the
audio, not a
audio.
video.
Okay, the audiogram. Okay, okay. I mean that's good. That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah. So why? I'm curious. Why? No, it's pretty popular. Everybody's like, oh, you have to do video. YouTube is this. YouTube is that. And I know you're doing YouTube technically, but it's just audio only. Why? I'm guessing that the interviews you do, you use video. You see your guest. Your guest sees
Mhm.
you, and so if you wanted to record it, you could record it. But why? Why haven't you made a switch on video yet? Can you explain, walk me through your thought process
Sure.
and the decision
Really
you took?
just it comes about from the fact that when I started the podcast 7 years ago, video really wasn't as easy as it is now. And so I started the podcast, I started my workflows, I started everything else without the thought of doing video. And that's kind of the workflows I've gotten set it up. And I haven't wanted to put in the time and the effort to shift my workflows to
Yeah,
include the video. So it's really not, I can't do it. It's, I've deliberately made the choice to not add it because it would change. Earlier, I said it takes me this long to edit an episode and so on and so on. All of
yeah,
that would change. No. Now, could I get a new system set up and it would work in and everything's efficient again? Yes, but that's going to take time. And right now, I don't want to invest that time and effort to make that shift. I've just
okay,
evaluated that the bang for the buck's not there for me. Nothing wrong with people that want to do the video. It's just for me that the bang for the buck's not there today.
yeah. Now that you've been doing the podcast for 7 years, right? And what would you say is the single thing that excites you the most when it comes to podcasting?
Every time I interview a guest, I think it's fun. I have one particular question that I really love to ask the guest that I ask every single guest, and getting to hear how they answer it, I think is the most fun that I have during every episode. It's interacting with the guest is the most fun on my end. Other than when I hear back from a listener or I run into somebody who's heard it and they talk to me about the impact it's had on them. It's just the guest is a lot more frequent. So you actually
Yeah,
get you get that feedback real time where the listeners, you
yeah,
don't always get it.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it's funny how this is more like a common thing that excites a lot of podcasters, having to have a conversation with a guest
Yeah.
and share their story and just chat with them.
And just hear, because again, as a coach, I think this is important that I learn to ask good questions and I learn to really listen to people and ask questions to pull out more information. So I'm kind of practicing the very skills I use as a coach, which is listening and asking questions, right? So
Yeah,
it's almost like practice for my job too, for what I love to do as a coach, because that's what I love to do as a coach is help people think through things and process and make decisions. And you do that by asking really good questions much more than you do it by trying to tell someone what to do. People oftentimes will answer their own questions if you just ask the right questions, if that makes sense.
yeah. Wow, people oftentimes will answer their own question if you just ask the right question.
Hmm.
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, it does make sense. Currently the podcast is about 7 years now. What are some of the modifications, goals, projections, and things you have in store for the podcast over the next couple of years?
I don't set super big goals or anything on the podcast other than just, evaluating every 6 months if I want to make any changes. And currently I'm the last evaluation I did, the evaluation was to not make any changes. So it's kind of continuing
Yeah,
as it is. I do want to try to get there's a few guests that I kind of have written down as my bucket list guests that, I'd like to try to get some of of them on over the next few years. Some bigger name authors and that kind of thing. Some folks that I've admired from afar. I've already had some. I had Dan Miller and a couple of other folks that are kind of fairly famous, and I'd like to get some more folks like that on the show. I think the other thing is I am starting to think about what it would look like to grandfather this particular podcast and start a different podcast. And I probably would start that one with video. So, that's kind of that part of it. But I'm not in the place where I'm going to do that yet, but I have started the kind of, what would it be? What would it look like? What would I change? What would I keep the same? That kind of thing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing some of the projections of the podcast with us. If what advice would you have for podcaster just starting out, thinking to start a podcast, and but I kind of discouraged or what advice do you have for them?
So a couple of things I would tell anyone who wants to get started. First off is you are going to hate your voice. You're going to hate listening to yourself. You're going to think how everything is bad. You're going to hear every mistake you make. You're going to hear every and so and I knows and all the other word fillers that we use. And you're going to do that for a good period of time. So when you start, this is where I get back to kind of what I did about saying, I'm going to do this for 6 months. You've got to commit to doing it with consistency for a long enough period of time to get past that, because there's going to be a period where I don't care how good you are. I don't care how much speaking you've done. I don't care about any preparation you've had. It's different. It's just different.
Yeah,
If you're doing a solo episode, it's weird to kind of talk to yourself in a room about something. If you've got a
yeah,
guest, it's different. Interviewing somebody is different than presenting or speaking or having a conversation. It is different. There's a skill to it. And if you don't commit to doing it long enough to get through that, oh, I hate this, I'm so bad at it kind of baggage, you're never going to get good at it. And for most people I've seen, that's at least 6 months. You've got to commit to doing it at least 6 months with regular consistency. And at that point, you'll start to look up and go, maybe I can do this after all. Still not going to be perfect. You'll never be perfect, but that's okay. You don't have to be perfect. But that
yeah,
idea of just committing and getting through that slump of, I've yet to talk to anyone who does a podcast that doesn't have a period of time where they're like, I hate my voice. I think I'm so bad at this. I can't stand listening to myself. All of these sorts of things go on in our head, and just recognizing that that's normal and it's going to happen, and just power through it to some extent.
yeah. Thank you so much, Scott, for sharing your podcast story with us on this podcast and for the advice.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If listeners want to learn more about you and what you do, where can they do that?
I actually put together a landing page just for your listeners. So if you go over to my website, which is at inspiredstewardship.com, and then just put in / podcast story, just all one word, podcast story, no spaces, it'll take you over to a page where I've got some free resources that folks can download. It's got information about my book, Inspired Living. It's got a link to my podcast as well, if you'd like to check it out. All of that's over at Inspired Stewardship. I'll speak English in a minute. See, there you go. InspiredStewardship.com / podcast story.
Yeah. Thank you so much for compiling the resources for my listeners. And thank you so much for taking out your time to share your podcast story with us.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Lots of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been really, really great chatting with you.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of my podcast story. I am Wisdom Okonkwo, and I hope this conversation sparked new ideas and gave you a deeper look into the heart of podcasting. If you've loved this episode, consider supporting the show by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/wisdomhq. Every bit helps keep the stories going. And hey, don't forget to follow, rate, and share this podcast with another podcaster or creator who would find it helpful. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.